know I said it before, but I'm going to say it again. Our musicians are amazing, and they make each of these Jazz Sundays special. So let's thank them one more time, please. Please pray with me. Lord, help us to see the beauty of your creation in all things and in all people. May we walk in the light of your grace, with hearts that cherish each moment and hands that serve all we meet. You have given us the capacity to choose good. Let us choose to live in harmony with your Spirit, embracing the light that you have planted within every soul. Amen. My brothers and sisters, we live in a world that is now more connected than ever before. Through social media, the internet, through global communications. But at the same time, many of us feel more disconnected than ever before. It is a paradox. In this age of connection, we are often struggling with loneliness, isolation, and spiritual disconnection. But Jesus offers us a different kind of connection, one that is deeper, more life-giving, and more transformative than anything we can find in this world. Over the next several weeks, we are going to explore the theme of connections, our connection to God, our connection to each other, and our connection to the world around us. Today, we begin by focusing on what it means to cherish these connections, how we nurture, protect, and deepen the relationships that God has initiated in our lives. And our grounding text for this series comes from John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Jesus invites us to stay connected to him, like branches to a vine, because without him, we cannot bear fruit, we cannot grow, and we cannot live fully into the calling that God has placed on our lives. But when we remain in him, when we stay connected, our lives become channels of grace, bearing fruit that lasts. Now, to understand connection in the Christian life, we must begin with God's grace. In the Methodist tradition, we recognize that God's grace is at the root of all our connections. Grace initiates the relationship, sustains it, and helps it grow. John Wesley taught that there are three primary forms of grace: prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Each of these forms of grace speaks to a different aspect of our connection with God. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before. Before we even know God, before we even think to seek God, his grace is already at work in our lives, preparing the way for us to come into relationship with him. John Wesley himself put this in a powerful phrase in a sermon from 1789 when he said, "Everyone has some measure of that light, some faint glimmering ray, which sooner or later, more or less, enlightens every man that cometh into the world." This grace is God's initial invitation, the infrastructure that allows connection to happen. And justifying grace brings us into a relationship with God. It is the moment when we accept God's invitation and are reconciled to him through faith in Jesus Christ. It is the moment where we get into the car and start the journey. Sanctifying grace continues to work in us after we have been justified. This is the grace that helps us grow, that deepens our connection with God, and that transforms us into the likeness of Christ. It is the journey of faith where we drive closer and closer to our destination of holiness. And in this sermon series, we will be exploring how God's grace undergirds all of our connections. The connections we cherish with God, with others, and even within ourselves are all built on this foundation of grace. And at the heart of all our connections is God, the great connector. In John 15, Jesus gives us the image of the vine and the branches. Just as branches cannot survive apart from the vine, we cannot live the fullness of life apart from our connection to Christ. The vine nourishes, sustains, and gives life to the branches. In the same way, God is the source of our life, the one who connects us to himself and to one another. Without this connection, we lose vitality. We wither. But when we remain connected to the vine, when we stay in relationship with Christ, our lives bear fruit. Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace fits perfectly into this imagery in the book of John. John Wesley taught that everyone has some measure of light. God's grace touches every single person, inviting us to grow, to be nourished, to bear fruit. This light, this prevenient grace, is like the life force that flows from the vine to the branches, connecting us all, even before we are aware of it. We are a part of something greater than ourselves. We are drawn into this divine web of grace by a God who is always reaching out to us. Luke echoes this in the book of Acts when he says, "In him we live and move and have our being." God is not far from any one of us. He is ever present, knitting together the fabric of our lives in ways we cannot always see or understand. It is a great mystery, but one that we can sense, like the deep, unseen roots of a tree spreading through the soil of our existence, grounding us in God's ever-present grace. But there are times in our lives when we feel that connection more deeply, when the space between the divine and human feels especially thin. The ancient Celtic Christians called these experiences thin places. These were not just physical locations, but moments when the boundary between heaven and earth seems to almost disappear, when God's presence feels closer, more real. And I believe that these thin places are not limited to sacred mountains or holy sites, but they can be found in the spaces between us, in our relationships, and in the simple, everyday moments of life. Every conversation where we truly listen to each other, every act of kindness that is given or received, every shared moment of joy or grief becomes a thin place. These are the moments when the mystical presence of God binds us together, when grace flows freely between us, and we are reminded of the deep connection that we share, not only with one another, but with God himself. Have you ever felt this? Perhaps in a moment of unexpected compassion, a kind word that touched your heart, or a shared silence that spoke volumes. These are the moments when we feel deeply connected, both to one another and to the great connector himself. And in these thin places, we are reminded of this great mystical nature of our faith. We experience the full reality of God's grace holding us together, an invisible force that sustains and connects us, whether we are aware of it or not. And yet these moments do not have to be grand or extraordinary. It's often the smallest actions, the ones we might often overlook, where these thin places emerge. A kind word, 10 seconds of listening to a conversation, a single moment of forgiveness. These small gestures, these seemingly insignificant moments, become sacred because they create space for God's grace to flow through us. Every small action we take has the potential to create a thin place, a place where heaven and earth meet, where God's grace becomes visible, where the connections are deepened and made holy. And this leads us to consider the power of small actions. How many of these thin places do we create by simple acts of love and service that we often take for granted? Because they are often formed by the smallest of actions. And they may seem small, but in the eyes of God, no action is insignificant. In fact, it is often in these moments that we see the greatest impact. It can happen in the most unexpected places. Even in a silent moment, when, with a child, for example, you may be bouncing a balloon back and forth. In that moment, no words are needed. Just pure joy shared between you, as if the very air between you is filled with grace. These are the thin places where heaven touches earth, where God's love becomes tangible, and where we feel deeply connected to the one who gives us life. Just a single conversation can open the door to deeper connection. So too can a small act of kindness ripple through our lives and in the lives of others in ways we cannot always see. Because again, grand gestures, major sacrifices, sweeping changes are not the only ways that we can impact life. Jesus teaches us a different lesson. It is often the smallest deeds done with great love that create the largest impact in our world. But in the same way, sometimes small action can lead to great harm. In Mark 9, verse 43, Jesus says, "If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and go to hell, to the unquenchable fire." Jesus speaks here not of grand events, but of small parts of ourselves: a hand, a foot, an eye. In the grand scheme of life, these may seem like somewhat smaller things, but they can lead to great destruction. And Jesus calls us to vigilance over the smallest parts of our lives because they do have the power to cause us to stumble, to lead us away from God. Small actions, whether good or bad, can have a profound impact on our connection with God and with others. And Jesus continues with a challenge. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. To the world of Jesus' time, salt was not merely a seasoning. It was precious. It was vital to life. Salt preserved. Salt kept things from decay. It gave food its flavor and protected what was good. Without salt, food spoiled. Without salt, things withered and wasted away. So when Jesus speaks of salt, his audience understood what he was saying. Salt was essential. It was life-giving. But Jesus was not limiting this idea merely to food. He was speaking of something far greater. He was speaking of our souls, our character, and our connections to one another. Salt represents what preserves the goodness in us, what keeps our spirits alive, what keeps our relationships from decaying. Salt is that unseen element that holds us together, that keeps us from falling into spiritual ruin. But Jesus gives us a warning. If salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? He's warning us about what happens when we lose the very thing that gives us life and meaning. If we neglect the small actions, if we fail to love, to serve, to forgive, to listen, then we lose our spiritual saltiness. We lose what gives us flavor, what gives our lives depth, what holds us together in community and connection with God. And once that saltiness is gone, once we let our hearts grow cold and indifferent, it is difficult, so very difficult to regain. Small actions keep us salted. Small actions, those moments of kindness, those words of truth, those acts of service, are what preserve the goodness in us. They are what keep our relationships strong. They are what guard our communities from spiritual decay. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, have salt in yourselves. Be at peace with one another. Do you hear this? We are not meant to walk this road alone. We are called to salt one another, to help preserve the goodness in each other. We are called to watch over one another in love. We are called to keep each other spiritually sharp, spiritually alive. This is what it means to cherish our connections with God and with one another. And this is no mere metaphor. Let me share with you how cherishing connections in our own community can lead to significant change, to the preservation of our salt. Some of you over the past several years have been involved with the listening groups as part of our Justice in Action initiative. These listening groups begin as simple conversations where we sit down with our neighbors and listen to their concerns. What keeps them up at night? What are their struggles? What are their fears? It may seem like a small thing, just showing up, just listening. But these small acts of listening have laid the foundation for systemic change. Through these listening situations, through these listening sessions, we have uncovered issues in our community that desperately need addressing. Housing insecurity, mental health services, racial justice, criminal justice reform. Small actions like attending a listening group lead to research, proposals, and ultimately policy change. What starts as a simple conversation becomes a grand movement for justice that holds our local leaders accountable. Small actions ripple outward, and before we know it, lives are being transformed, injustices are being addressed, and God's grace is fully at work. You may feel like your contribution is small, but in the hands of God, it is powerful. Every small action, every choice to listen, every time you show up for somebody else, it matters. It all matters to God. These small actions have eternal significance because they are part of God's work of justice and love. Let us not underestimate the power of small actions. Let us cherish these small moments and actions, knowing that in the hands of God, even the smallest gesture can ripple through eternity. As we come to the close of this message, let us reflect on the ways in which God's grace works in our lives, preparing us, sustaining us, and growing us. Before we ever sought God, He sought us. Prevenient grace is that light that shines into every heart, the invitation that calls each of us into relationship with Him. God lays the foundation for every single connection, both with Him and with others, and we are invited to respond. Justifying grace brings us into relationship with God. When we accept His invitation, we are made new, reconciled to Him through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Our connection to God is not one of our own making. It is a gift of His perfect justifying grace. And sanctifying grace is the ongoing work of God's Spirit in our lives, transforming us, pruning what needs to be removed, nurturing what needs to grow. Every small act of faithfulness, every choice to love, every step towards holiness is an act of sanctifying grace. We are called to cherish the connections that God has given us, to protect them, nurture them, and allow God to transform them. Just as the branches rely on the vine for life, we rely on God's grace to sustain and grow our spiritual and communal connections. This week, I challenge you to reflect on your own connections, your connection with God, with others, and with yourself. Where are the small places that need just a little bit of attention? What are the small actions you can take to cherish and grow these connections? Perhaps it is spending a little bit more time in prayer. Maybe it's reaching out to a loved one or offering a modicum of forgiveness where it is needed. Remember, in God's kingdom, no action is too small to make a difference. Let us go forth, trusting in the grace of God, the great connector who sustains us, transforms us, and guides us every step of the way. Amen.